My name is Sarah Powell. I am the Sustainable and Resilient Communities Extension Professional for Westchester County here in New York, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our first annual Long Island Sound Sustainable and Resilient Communities Bi-State Workshop. I promised we'd get started right on time, so here we are. We gave everybody an extra minute. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited by the response to this workshop, and we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to dive right in. First off, we have some meeting rules. As you can probably see, we have a lot of people here today, so we're asking everyone, please keep your phones and audio on mute unless you're speaking, and then keep your camera off as well to help us preserve bandwidth and make sure everybody's got a good, strong connection. This entire workshop is going to be recorded, including our breakout rooms, and we will be sure to share the links with everyone in the coming weeks following our workshop. I also want to note that the live transcription is turned on and available if that's of interest to you. You can turn it on by clicking the live transcript button in your Zoom toolbar. So the next thing is that we're going to be using some interactive polls today to gather feedback. So if you can have an extra browser window open, that would be great, or have your cell phone nearby, and we're going to give you some directions on how to do that in just a minute. And then last but not least, given that we are expecting a lot of people today, please do try and reserve the use of the chat for questions for our speakers, or if you're having any technical issues. We have some folks that are going to do their best to try and help you out with that, if so, on the back end. So, please do feel free to rename yourself and include your affiliation and your pronouns in your Zoom name, but don't put that info in the chat today. All right, all of you hopefully received a copy of the agenda from me yesterday or maybe earlier today. But again, here's a quick look at what we have in store for our workshop. Momentarily, myself and my colleagues are going to be sharing some findings from the first year of our work together and also introducing a new grant writing assistance program. We're then going to take a quick stretch break before we have our first guest speakers of the day, who are going to discuss 2 Long Island Sound funding opportunities and offer their tips for successful grant applications. Then we're going to go into our first round of concurrent breakout sessions. And again, hopefully all of you got information from me about our speakers and the presentations during those sessions. And so hopefully you know which session you want to tune into. After those sessions, we will have one last quick break before we come back to go into our last round of concurrent presentations. Those feature a wonderful slate of speakers from both New York and Connecticut to share information on helpful tools for sustainability and resilience planning. And then last but not least, hopefully everyone will still be here and stick around for some parting thoughts and a final opportunity for today, at least, to give us some feedback. Again, you will hear from us after this workshop. We'll be sharing links to all the recordings and some other follow-up materials. So with that, we are going to dive right in. Hopefully everyone who's on this call today knows about Long Island Sound Study, or LIS. Long Island Sound Study is a bi-state partnership that was formed in 1985, consisting of federal and state agencies, user groups, and concerned stakeholders dedicated to restoring and protecting Long Island Sound. So the work of LIS is guided by a comprehensive conservation and management plan, or CCMP. And this document was last updated in 2015 and has ambitious targets to drive progress toward restoration of the sound through 2035. The CCMP seeks to achieve 4 themes: clean waters and healthy watersheds, thriving habitats and abundant wildlife, sustainable and resilient communities, and sound science and inclusive management. So the Sustainable and Resilient Communities, or SRC theme, is aimed at supporting vibrant, informed, and engaged communities that use, appreciate, and help protect Long Island Sound. So about a year ago, myself and my colleagues, 2 of whom you'll hear from momentarily, were brought on board to really focus on that SRC theme. Our work is guided by a 5-year work plan that was put together by the SRC work group through Long Island Sound Study. And as SRC extension professionals, we are tasked with providing resources and guidance to help our communities adapt to climate change and other environmental challenges, primarily focusing in the coastal portion of the LIS watershed of both Connecticut and New York, as you see in the map here. And so this map also shows you our respective areas of focus. Again, I am based in Westchester County, New York, and work for New York Sea Grant out of the Cornell Cooperative Extension Office here in Elmsford. And I'm going to let my other 2 New York colleagues introduce themselves momentarily. But did want to note that our Western Connecticut counterpart, Deb Abibu, who I'm sure many of you on this call know, she's currently out on leave, and the Eastern Connecticut SRC position is currently being filled. So Deb's going to be back in a few weeks, but for today, you're going to hear from Sarah, Elizabeth, and I. And so I want to turn it over to them to come on camera and introduce themselves quickly. So Sarah, why don't you go first, followed by Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Schaefer-Brown. Thank you all for joining. I'm the Sustainable and Resilient Communities Extension Professional in Nassau County.
Hi, everyone. Elizabeth Hornstein. I'm the Sustainable and Resilient.
Oh, Elizabeth, you accidentally muted yourself, but
Yes, I'm sorry. I'll do it again. Elizabeth Hornstein, Sustainable and Resilient Communities Extension Professional for Suffolk County. Good afternoon, everyone.
Now Sarah Powell is.
Sarah Powell, you're on mute.
yeah, sorry, I couldn't get my my little screen to pop back up. All right, we're getting our hiccups out of the way early. Ready to go. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. Now I want to turn to, let me get my windows back in order. Okay, so now that we've introduced ourselves and our regions, we're going to go into those interactive polls that I promised. So as you can see on this slide here, we have two ways that you can participate. We're using a technology called Poll Everywhere, and so I want to get everyone acquainted with it. So the first way that you can participate in this poll is via that browser window I mentioned. And if you do that, you're going to go to the website seen here, and that I believe is being put in the chat right now. And if you want to participate on your phone, you text LIS RES to that number. I see people already chiming in. Fantastic. And I do just want to note, if you're doing it via text, you will get a message once you text this, and do not click the link that is in that message. It's a little confusing, but basically you'll get a response notifying you that you joined the session. And at the bottom of that note is a link. It looks like you want to click on it, but don't do that. Don't click it. So once you get that notification message that you've joined, all you have to do is text in your answer. So A, B, C, D, etc. So give folks a second to respond here. And I should note, yeah, don't put it in the Zoom chat. That's not going to help you. The letters are only for if you are participating via text on your phone. And then again, if you go to that pollev.com/LISRES, you should see the options for you to click on there. Give just a few more minutes for people to get themselves situated. They're getting a good number of responses. All right. All right. No worries if you're still trying to log in. We will have more polls coming, and this next one is a continuation actually of this question. And before I click over, because I still see people answering, I do want to say this next question is really only it's limited to folks who are participating via the browser. Sorry, texters, but this is the only one of the day that you won't be able to do. And so for this next question, if you are in a browser window, can you go ahead and click and see where everyone's coming from today? And I'll note, if you're joining from outside of this map, sorry, not to exclude you, but it was hard to really zoom in. So feel free to either, put yourself in your favorite water body of the sound or just wait for our next poll. Let's see. Awesome. Very cool to see where people are joining from. I don't know why it just reset, but I see them all popping up. Very fun. Okay. Cool. Well, again, thank you. Even if folks are still clicking, thank you so much for being here. It's really cool to see where everyone's tuning in from. And then our next question is also to help us kind of get an understanding of who's in the room today. If you could, either via text or the browser, tell us, where you're coming from. What sector best represents you? Okay. That's great. Thanks, everyone. Definitely keep answering if you haven't already. Really helpful to know who is in the room today. Okay, and then last poll question for now, we will have more throughout the day, is if you could tell us in a few words, or preferably maybe one, what is the most pressing challenge your community is facing when it comes to being more sustainable and resilient? And I'll just note that if you are going to put in a short phrase, if you could try and link your answers with underscores, this poll question is going to build a word cloud for us, and multi-word answers will get split up unless they're actually tied together with underscores or dashes. So, and you can answer more than once if you'd like. And again, this will work via the browser or texting on your phone. All right. Very cool. So funding and flooding are the big ones, which is what I would have guessed, honestly. This is really great. I mean, not great that there's flooding and people need funding, but happy that everyone's here for the same reason. Awesome. I'm gonna let that run for one more second. But I see the time. I think it is time that we move on to our next piece. So thanks everybody. For those of you participating in either way, really in the browser, go ahead and leave that open because again, we will be using it later on today. So just like that, we are on to the next item of our agenda, where myself and my colleagues are going to share some findings and next steps from the needs assessment we have been conducting over the past year. And as I said before, our work is guided by a 5-year work plan that was put together by our Sustainable and Resilient Communities work group. And that work plan is organized around five priorities expressed as the outcomes you see here. So the goal is that our work is going to result in better coordinated regional responses to environmental challenges, that there will be better trained community decision makers, increased planning for resilient infrastructure improvements, that government services will remain viable in the face of climate change and other stressors, and that we will be able to help with facilitated implementation of projects throughout the region. There are also 2 overarching themes throughout the work plan: integration of socioeconomic considerations with the environment and also environmental justice. And these themes are really interwoven into all of our work plan tasks. And so for our first year, the first major task that we needed to do was conduct a needs assessment to help us understand what are the threats and hazards our communities are facing, any current goals or actions or projects that are happening, barriers to implementation that our communities are facing, and ultimately really to help identify where and what support is needed to hopefully overcome those barriers. So the findings of our needs assessment that we're going to tell you about today are going to be what's guiding every aspect of our work moving forward. So really everything we create, whether it be an online resource hub, trainer and education programs, or this annual by-state workshop, we want to ensure that they're really grounded in our community's needs and will help achieve our mutual goals. And our results will also help us to provide the most accurate support we can to an ongoing USGS compound flood risk modeling effort. And ultimately, our goals are to really improve coordination among levels of government, help establish a project pipeline, if you will, of projects and efforts at various stages that are ready to jump on funding as it becomes available, and also figure out how we can target investments to really break down the barriers that we heard about through our needs assessment. And you're going to hear more about our first effort at doing that just a little bit later. All right. So that set the stage a bit. And I do want to mention, as you're looking at this image that shows all the conversations we had throughout our needs assessment, that our needs assessment was done informally. We didn't send out surveys or anything like that because due to the nature of our funding, we didn't want to be delayed by the Paperwork Reduction Act. And so we had a series of informal discussions and meetings with a wide range of stakeholders. So in this map, again, you see our coastal boundary outline in yellow. The shading represents our 3 New York counties and the COGs in Connecticut. And then town and city boundaries are also shown, but I should note that Long Island villages are not, because there are so many of them. Government groups are shown in greens and blues. Nonprofits and NGO groups are shown in purples and pinks. And then community groups in reds and oranges, and utilities and transportation in yellow. And so the dots on this map represent more than 300 stakeholder conversations that were held. And as a team, we really connected with about 60% of our municipalities in the coastal boundary. This number includes both counties, towns, cities, and villages, which is pretty impressive, if I may say so myself, given that there are 37 villages in Nassau County alone, for example. And I just also want to note that these dots may represent more than one meeting or person that we connected with, so it's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. But this is intended to give you an idea of the broad range of stakeholders that we were able to connect with during our needs assessment. And this next graph shows the entities that we reached. So, we didn't necessarily count individuals reached, but counted them as entities. So, for example, we connected with staff or committees in 56 separate municipalities, and that's represented by the big blue wedge there. And what this chart shows you is that roughly half of our conversations occurred with government entities and elected officials, including village staff, primarily on Long Island, that essentially serve as their elected boards. Another 30% of our conversations happened with environmental groups, foundations, and educational institutions, and the remaining 20% with community groups, community leaders, economic entities, indigenous nations, churches, and resource users. All right, so I've teed up Elizabeth. I'm going to hand it over to her to share what we actually found through the needs assessment.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So the biggest environmental threat that we heard about across all of our regions was flooding or stormwater and associated flooding impacts with that. We also heard about coastal flooding and rising water levels, extreme weather and storm events, concerns about water quality, both surface water quality and drinking water. We heard about erosion of beaches, dunes, and bluffs, as well as the loss and degradation of coastal habitats like wetlands, eelgrass, shellfish. And we heard concerns about impacts from development and how that affects our habitats and our water quality. Other things we heard about were shifting seasons and species, tree loss, and increasing concerns about invasive species. And I'll note that while the environmental threats that we heard about varied a little bit from community to community, the stakeholders within a community tended to bring up the same environmental threats. We did find that when speaking with underrepresented groups or communities with environmental justice concerns, that they were most concerned about threats that impacted the health and safety of their families and their communities. And next slide, Sarah. So now I'm going to get into the challenges and barriers that came up that prevent action and implementation. And there's going to be several slides on these, and you'll note on these slides that there are blue boxes on each of them that provide some specific examples that came out from our conversations to provide a bit more context to each of the barriers that I'm going to be speaking about. So the biggest barrier that came up for all of us was limited capacity. When talking with government agencies, we heard that they often have a lack of adequate staff or time of existing staff to really devote to addressing these environmental and climate issues. We also heard that often government agencies, as well as other entities, they may not have the expertise and knowledge to manage certain facets of a program and project, and so need some outside assistance and expertise. Next slide, Sarah. Across all our groups, we also heard that there is limited access or limited awareness about information on the Long Island Sound, about information on climate and environmental threats, best management practices, and science data, resources, and access to experts. And along with this limited capacity issue, we heard about a lack of coordination. So we heard across all levels of government that there is inefficient coordination or sometimes non-existent coordination. We also heard that there can be a lack of coordination among neighboring municipalities that are all around the same water body. And in particular, we heard that this lack of coordination is most prevalent for stormwater management, infrastructure, permitting, and shoreline management. And the last one, shoreline management, there's particular issues because a lot of the Long Island Sound shoreline is privately owned. So you have all of these private property owners that are each doing their own thing. And this can also create some conflicts between private and public interests. In addition to just hearing about the lack of coordination among government agencies, we also heard about a lack of coordination between governments and their communities. And this may be because government entities don't have the time or the skills necessary to effectively engage with all of the diverse groups in their communities. But the issue here is that when you don't have that coordination, that can lead to decision-making that may not meet the needs of the community, and that can lead to a lack of trust and buy-in. Next. Another barrier that we heard about relates to governance. So we heard that there's often a lack of political will and leadership and action to move projects and initiatives forward. And I'll note that in some communities, there is more political will and leadership than others. So there is a bit of a sliding scale and it does vary. But overall, we found that there's a lot of studies and plans out there, but a lot of them are not moving forward or being implemented. We also heard that there can be frequent changes in our elected leaders, and that can make it difficult to maintain momentum, especially since resilience plans and projects often take a long time. You have to get funding, and there's a lot of steps for that implementation. So it's really important that you have that consistent, sustained momentum in order to move things forward. Next slide. Another thing we heard about is that codes can be outdated and may not be up to the standards of today and meet best management practices. And we also heard that it can be onerous to update those codes though. So that may be, they may not being updated as they should be. And we heard that enforcement of codes can be uneven and that there can also be confusion when you have overlapping jurisdictions and different entities have different codes and rules. And then from private property owners and businesses, we did hear some concerns about how updating codes would impact them and would potentially add costs for them. Next. And then another barrier that came up, probably not surprising, was funding. So we heard from pretty much all groups that it's hard to navigate the various funding and grant opportunities that are out there, to understand the different requirements for each of these opportunities and to know which grants to apply to. And then we heard that grant requirements can often be quite burdensome. And this can prohibit applying for the grants. So it can be difficult to come up with the match for the grant, and the management and the reporting for the grant can be quite time intensive. And so that may be prohibitive for some groups. We also heard that just applying to the grant is time intensive. And when you've taken the time to apply to the grant and then you don't get the grant, that can potentially discourage you from applying again in the future. And so this can create this cycle where we have groups that have the capacity and resources, they are continually the ones getting the grants, and groups with lower capacity don't get the grants. And so it creates this inequitable distribution. And along with this, we heard that there's a lack of adequate and long-term funding to build up staff levels and to advance programs and projects and long-term visions and plans. We also heard that there's limited funding opportunities for planning and design, which is necessary before you can get to that implementation phase. And then also limited funding for maintenance and monitoring, which is needed following implementation. We also heard that people felt like there was limited funding opportunities for capacity building so that groups could adequately build up that capacity, and limited funding opportunities for private landowners and businesses. And the final barrier that I'm going to talk about is institutional inequities. So we heard that there can be a lack of inclusion from the full range of communities, particularly the most vulnerable communities and historically marginalized communities. And things like lack of information in diverse languages, the way our programs are designed, the way our policies are, these can all be barriers that can limit that full participation. We also heard that decision makers may not be fully representative of the communities that they are serving, and thus consideration, concerns, and issues of those communities may not be represented in the decisions that are being made. And that can create a lack of trust or a disconnect between communities and their governments and institutions, and prohibit that collaboration and co-development of solutions that should really be occurring. So now I'm going to talk about the needs that we heard about, and these pretty much follow on to many of those challenges and barriers that I just went over. So we heard about the need for increased leadership and local champions in order to move projects and initiatives forward. We heard about a need for increased capacity, including increased funding, as well as the ability to connect and coordinate with partners that can provide assistance and that expertise. We also heard about a need for more coordinated approaches to planning, both at the watershed and regional scale, and for more strategic partnerships. And then we heard a lot from communities that they want to know about what other communities that are like them are doing to address these environmental and climate threats. So the sharing of experiences and case studies, which is one of the things we're trying to do in today's workshop. We also heard that communities need help identifying funding opportunities and the resources and tools that are out there that can help them with planning and implementation. And along with this, we heard about a need for more technical guidance, so more access to scientific experts, to help them understand things like how to incorporate sea level rise projections, access to engineers that can help them design their projects, as well as more of an understanding of how different climate adaptation solutions, their impact economically, and a greater understanding of ecosystem valuation services. We also heard that many groups would like a step-by-step guide of what to do. They want to know, how can I update my codes to make our community more resilient? How do we go about identifying and conceptualizing projects? And then how do you communicate those priorities to your decision makers? We also heard a need for more general education and outreach on a range of topics. This includes more education and outreach to both elected leaders as well as to the general public. So with that, I am now going to turn it over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk about our next steps.
Hi, everybody. As Elizabeth mentioned, there's a lot of needs and challenges and barriers that we all heard of during our work. And so we've come up with training and education ideas and recommendations with our SRC counterparts, and they're listed here on our slide. And many of these are directly tied back to the needs that Elizabeth just mentioned. So having a series on resilience for municipalities to incorporate resilience not only into the mindset, but into planning and frameworks, and also creating strategies that incorporate resilience. We also heard that information on grants and assistance on writing grants is something that's very needed. So having simple guidance on grant opportunities and requirements. We also are thinking of doing trainings on identifying priorities and communicating effectively with all audiences, trainings on ecosystem service valuation, trainings on how to use existing or new tools, education on topical issues such as living shorelines or green infrastructure, and workshops to empower local leaders. And I'll just note that these programs may be undertaken with other partners, so please let us know if you want to coordinate efforts. Next slide. And so this was mentioned previously in the presentation by Sarah, but I just want to reiterate that these are some of our next steps for this year and next year, and these are all focused on the advancement of sustainable and resilient Long Island Sound communities. And so they include development and maintenance of a Long Island Sound resource hub, which will be a simple user-friendly online portal for accessing Long Island Sound information, data, funding, tools, relevant workshops and trainings, case studies, and lessons learned from other projects. we'll be holding trainings to deliver services and education for the prioritized items on the previous slide, and also continue to hold an annual bi-state workshop like the one we're holding today to continue building a Long Island Sound wide network. And we're also working with the USGS on the Long Island wide compound flood risk model, which will assess the compound flood risk from the combined effects of sea level rise on storm surge, tidal and groundwater flooding and stormwater. And this model will be really useful for planning and particularly infrastructure planning. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but our Breaking Down Barriers program is one that we are rolling out to try to address the most important or priority barriers that we're hearing in our regions. So we've rolled out the Long Island Sound Resilience Grant Writing Assistance Program as of November 15th, and I'll be putting in a little more detail here about that in a few minutes. So we'll also be continuing to lay the foundation for increased government coordination across levels of government and neighboring communities, and encouraging regional planning and connecting partners and agencies on overlapping issues, and also connecting our stakeholders who need assistance with nonprofit partners or experts that might already be working on that issue, and also bringing community concerns to local, state, and federal leaders. And we will also be focusing on advancing high impact projects across the region and locally, and implementing BMPs or best management practices that can be used as a model for other communities within our Long Island Sound community. And our relationships with our communities will continue to evolve, and we'll be learning more as time goes on about what specific support is needed, and all of that information is going to be directed back into our on the ground work as we continue going forward. So as you've all heard, you know, our work so far has shown that for communities across New York and Connecticut, obtaining funding is one of the main barriers to planning, design, and implementing sustainable and resilient focused projects. And we've also heard that there's a lack of capacity and expertise and resources to prepare and apply for the funding and administer that awarded funding. So with US EPA funding through the Long Island Sound study, New York Sea Grant and Connecticut Sea Grant announced a funding opportunity entitled the Long Island Sound Resilience Grant Writing Assistance Program on November 15th, which is open to municipalities and community organizations. Next slide. So the intent of this program is to facilitate the hiring of grant preparation and writing support to assist with the development of a grant application for a sustainable and resilient focused project that will impact communities within or partially within that Long Island Sound coastal boundary within Westchester, Nassau, and Suffolk counties, and Western Connecticut and Eastern Connecticut. And it's our aim to reduce staffing and capacity barriers that municipalities and community groups may face when applying for competitive funding opportunities. Funding is going to be awarded in a range of $5,000 to $9,950 per application, and that funding will be awarded directly to the grant preparation and writing support contractor on a cost reimbursable basis, and match will not be required. So if you have your phone handy right now, you can scan the QR code that is on this slide here. There's one for New York Sea Grant and one for Connecticut Sea Grant. Those QR codes will take you to a link directly to those web pages where you can find out more information about that RFP. And I believe the links are also being shared in the chat as well, if that's an easier way to access the information. Applications will be accepted on a rolling basis until all available funding is allocated, which may be no later than September 30th, 2023. And applications should be submitted by filling out and submitting the application at the linked Google form within that application, or there is a separate application form that you can fill out and either email to listresilience@gmail.com or submit via mail, and the mailing addresses are included in that application. And communities that are participating in this program can receive support for grant preparation and writing. And this support may include, but is not certainly limited to, budget preparation, cost benefit analysis, writing and narrative development, mapping, and application preparation and submission. So the program is essentially a grant to get a grant. So the aim of the program is not only to reduce staffing and capacity barriers, but also to help communities develop successful, sustainable, and resilience-focused project grant applications. And we also want to help municipalities and community organizations develop the capacity for navigating the funding landscape. So you'll see on this slide here, the map with the focus areas for the program, and the type of projects eligible for this program include planning, design, and implementation projects. And there is a lot more detail information in that RFP document, but essentially projects eligible for this program should foster a sustainable and resilient Long Island Sound and should advance a community's efforts to handle the impacts of climate change while achieving well-being for all communities, particularly those communities with environmental justice concerns. And some examples include sustainability and resilience plans, watershed plans or 9-element plans, green infrastructure projects, shoreline projects, projects that reduce flooding or address flooding, and projects that may improve habitat. Next slide. And so we have a very simple application process. We were very focused on making this process as simple as possible to encourage application for assistance from our communities that we know are already overburdened. So we want to know these 4 main items, which are on this slide. We want to know the applicant information, what support is needed for that grant preparation and writing support. So you would also need to include what consultant you want to work with or what support service person you want to work with. And then we need to know what funding opportunity or opportunities you are targeting. And then a general description of the project you wish to complete if you were able to get that other grant funding. And the questions on this slide are the only ones that are required to apply through our program. And as I said before, there's a very simple Google form you can use or fill out a simple application form and submit that via email or mail. Next slide. So we will be hosting 2 virtual webinars to review the program in more detail and have time for extended questions and answer. We'll be having one for New York applicants and one for Connecticut applicants. The New York one is December 7th, 11:30 to 12:30. You can still register for that webinar now. And the Connecticut application informational webinar is December 13th, 2 to 3 p.m. I believe links to those registrations are in the chat right now. But certainly let us know if you need additional information and have not received it. And we'll be also having an open feedback period for interested applicants prior to application submission. So that started when we announced the funding opportunity on November 15th. And it will be open through the time when the application submission closes on September 30th of next year. And this will involve, we can have phone calls, emails with applicants to determine if you're eligible and provide feedback. And I'll also note, I noted something in the chat earlier, we do have a link within the application to current and upcoming grant opportunities. So that is available. And we also can provide that information separately if that's requested. And that'll be something we'll be sharing during those webinars as well. Yes, so if you have any questions at all, please email lisresilience@gmail.com. And I will note that this is the first year of our Breaking Down Barriers program, and we'll be modifying this program based on your feedback from this year, so we can continue to make sure that our programs are addressing the most important barriers we're hearing in our region. Thank you.
Okay, now I think we want to, if hopefully everyone still has their polls open. There we go. Yep, we want to know which barrier that we identified through our needs assessment work really resonated the most with you. And I will note you're only able to choose one option on this poll. So if you choose and then change your mind, you have to go and hit the little button to change it. Yeah, we're curious to see. Give folks a second, and if you were slow to join, thank you, Jimena. She's putting some instructions in the chat. I should have said, if you weren't here at the beginning when we gave the instructions, yes, there are 2 ways to participate in the polls today, either via a browser window or via text. And if you're participating via text, when you text those letters to that number, you will get a message that has a link at the bottom of it. Don't click that. It's very confusing, but just ignore that link, and then you can go ahead and submit your answer, A, B, C, D, etc. Okay. Based on these results, I'd say, yeah, the capacity is definitely the biggest one we heard about. So that seems to jive with folks on the call today. All right, our next poll question. Of the training opportunities that Sarah mentioned that we're thinking about doing, which ones are you most interested in? So I'll note for this one, you can pick more than one answer. You're not limited to just one. But yeah, we'd love to hear some feedback on what's of most interest to you as we move into next year and begin developing some of these. Awesome. Give folks just a little bit more time. Oh, see people changing some answers. They're going up and down. I love it. All right. Thank you for that. And then our next question is, if I can get it to click, there we go. Are there things that you would like training programs developed for education on that we didn't mention today? Oh, was a little late, or I was a little fast clicking for somebody. Sorry about that, but we'll go back and add your vote to the last poll. But yeah, please let us know if there's other ideas that you have for training programs or education that we didn't mention today. Oh, I love it. Someone's really paying attention to my instructions. Thank you for that. Training fixes you. Great. Excellent. Love the idea of field visits. All right. State requirements. Great. Sweet. Awesome. Perfect. Awesome. I'm going to leave this open so people can keep answering. This is really great and helpful. But I will note, Elizabeth, I'm not sure, I'm not paying attention to the questions. We do have about 10 more minutes for questions and answers. So if folks have questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat.
Yes, we actually do have a few questions from the chat. The first thing I wanted to note is that we will be making these slides available after the fact and sharing the recording because that was a question in the chat. And another question that we had in the chat was if we're working on making grant info more accessible. So maybe I will let Sarah S. talk more about what we are doing for the Breaking Down Barriers program and in general making grant info available.
Yeah, so I mentioned when I spoke through my my overview of the Breaking Down Barriers program that we are including a list of current and upcoming grants, and that list is currently linked within the application. And there are federal and New York and Connecticut specific grant opportunities listed in there. We are intending to keep that list updated, going through it every month or few months or so, depending on, you know, the frequency of new grants coming out, and sending that out as well to our partners. It's our intention to make this resource hub a place where grant opportunities are easily accessible. So, you know, going forward, I think we will have a better place to push that information out. But for right now, we're just going through and sending that information out via email to our partners. And I think we're going to have more information later on in the workshop about funding opportunities and how to access those current funding opportunities. So we are trying to work on it because we know that it is hard to navigate.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yes, so stay tuned because we have more on funding coming up next. Another question we had from the chat is, does training include planning and design of projects for local municipalities? So I think the short answer there is yes, we will be providing training on all sorts of things, including how to plan and what resources are out there and what information is available to help with that planning and design for your projects. And then actually, Sarah asked, we have another question related to the Breaking Down Barriers program. Do programs have to wholly reside in the coastal areas identified, or can we apply for grants even if there is a even if it's only partially within the targeted area?
So this year we are allowing, so the project will need to benefit a community either within that coastal boundary or partially within. So if you're partially within, I would say you're eligible. I did want to make a note that if an entity is located, you know, outside of the coastal boundary, but they're going to be focused on a project that's within the coastal boundary, within Westchester, Nassau, Suffolk, Eastern and Western Connecticut, then that would be an eligible project as well. So the entity doesn't itself need to be located within that coastal boundary, but the project, the benefit needs to be within the coastal boundary.
Okay, and then another question on that program, can you apply for grant assistance for more than one project per community group and municipality?
Yeah, so I think that this year we're going to allow a municipality can apply for include one project and have multiple grant opportunities that you are identifying that you'll target to advance that project, and all that information can be in one grant application to our grant writing assistance program. I think that because this year is the first year and we kind of do have limited funding, we are most likely going to limit the award of funding to one time per municipality or community group. So I would say that if you do have a project in mind, just try to focus on your highest priority projects and list all of the grant opportunities that you think you could apply for within your grant application for our grant writing assistance program. But it, of course, needs to be under that cap of $9,950 for support from your consultant or your contractor that you're going to be using.
Great. Okay, and then I see another question here. Can we provide a copy of the poll results? We think that's possible, Sarah Powell?
Yes, I believe it is possible. Yes, I think we can.
Okay.
In our follow-up materials that we'll send out post-workshop, I'll be able to download these and we'll share them with everyone.
Great. And then there was just a couple comments here in the chat that Catherine Morris noted she'd love to coordinate efforts in Bridgeport and Stratford and New Haven. So a note for the Connecticut folks. We will, and I see, and West Haven. So we'll try to make sure that we follow up with you on that. And then I also see a comment here that balancing natural and human uses of the land. They mentioned they love that, and that's so important. And nature's needs are left out too often. And I don't see any other, unless recently I'm not seeing anything else from the chat that we haven't addressed yet.
All right, I'd say if anyone has one last question, let's do it. We're just a couple minutes ahead of schedule, which is great. Oh, I see another partner. Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. We will make note of that. I'd say, why don't we go ahead and take our quick 5-minute break? Everybody be back here a couple minutes before 1:30, and we'll keep moving right along. Does that sound good? All right. Please be back by, let's say, 1:28, since we're a couple minutes early. See everybody in a minute.
Okay, everyone, I think we are going to get started with our next session. I hope everyone had a few minutes to stretch. So our next session is Long Island Sound Funding Opportunities Tips for Success. And before we get going, I just want to note that there was one last question that I saw went into the chat right after we took our break about training on grant writing for municipal staff. That is definitely something on our radar that we can provide training for. And hopefully you're still around for this session, as we are going to be providing some tips for success on how to apply for funding opportunities coming up. So as a reminder, we are recording and we will be distributing the recording to attendees, and we can share all of these slides. And I also want to remind folks to please use the chat for questions, and to please try to limit the back and forth discussion in the chat, and just reserve it for questions for the speakers and for technical questions, so that it's easier for us to filter out those questions. So we have two great presenters lined up for today's session, talking about two Long Island Sound funding opportunities, the Long Island Sound Stewardship Fund and the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. And we're going to let both of these speakers talk, and then we will do questions at the end. So again, put those questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can today. If we can't get to your question, we will do our best to follow up in our post-workshop materials. So before I introduce our first speaker, we do have a few poll questions for you before we get started here. So the first question we want to know is, are you aware of these grant programs, the Long Island Sound Stewardship Fund and the Long Island Futures Fund? Okay, I'm seeing a good amount of yes. So that's great. And hopefully, I should have noted for anyone who maybe knew that there are two ways to respond to these polls, using the link that's listed at the top there, or using your text. You can text LIS res to 2233 if you'd like to do it that way, or go to the link. And I see Jimena re-putting the instructions in the chat now. Thank you, Jimena. All right, so about 3/4 of you are already familiar with these grant programs, and the rest of you will know about them very soon. So our next question is, have you applied to the Futures Fund before? Okay, great. Okay, and now a follow on to that, if you've applied before, so just for those of you that have applied, were you successful? All right, that's not bad. Okay, all right, now the stewardship fund. Who has applied to the stewardship fund before? All right, so quite a bit have applied to the stewardship fund as well. I mean, sorry, yeah, Sarah Powell. I read that wrong. No, not many people have applied to the stewardship fund. Thank you. Okay, so for the few of you that have applied to the stewardship fund, were you successful? All right, 50-50. Okay, well, with that, I am going to introduce our first speaker, Trip Killen, the Executive Director of the Genium Foundation, a small family foundation in Connecticut that focuses on conservation issues. Previously, he was Associate Director of the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance, an advocacy group working to preserve wild places in the land of enchantment. So Trip, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to both Sarahs as well. It's been a great presentation. I'm learning a bunch and excited to be here. To talk a little bit about it, it seems like, there's some folks who haven't heard of the Funders Collaborative Stewardship Fund yet, so it'll be nice to know about that and talk a little bit about how it might be able to help you solve some of the problems that we've been talking about today. So we'll go through this pretty quickly. Thank you. Talk about who we are. The Funders Collaborative is a group of almost 20 foundations and individual donors who are interested in trying to work together to save the Long Island Sound. Now, we'll be talking about the collaborative, which is all of those foundations, but then also our stewardship fund, which is our pooled funding bit. So we'll get into those details. So all of us are involved in what we could call private philanthropy, right? We're not, for the most part, not government money. Some of us have a little bit of government money in our funds, especially NIFWIF, who we'll hear more about later. But most of it's private, direct philanthropy. So one, it doesn't tend to have as many requirements and onerous types of activities as government funding does, but it's also a lot less money than government money and government funding opportunities. We all have something in common that we care about Long Island Sound, but we also have something in common that none of us are solely focused on Long Island Sound. All these foundations and funders have areas of interest that are outside of that. And we also have in common the fact that we hate to make bad grants. We hate to have what feels like a small amount of money to us that's available to us to give to the great causes. And we see all the vast need that's out there. We want to make sure that we're doing it as well as we can. So what are some of those things that we're trying to do? First of all, we spend a lot of our time trying to learn who's out there in this issue space, not only amongst ourselves, but also among the nonprofit organizations, learning who's out there, what work they're doing, what things need to be done, how we can best fit into that. We do a lot of learning around the issue area. What's happening with stormwater? How is that different on Long Island versus Connecticut? What's going on with bioextraction? What are the technologies that are coming? Trying to make ourselves better informed decision makers, I think, was one of the needs that was listed earlier in the presentation from the needs assessment. And then given that learning and networking, how can we come up with creative ways to do funding? Move to the next slide. Well, we obviously do funding in our individual programs, so you can apply to, let's say, the Westchester Community Foundation. Hi, Tara. And you can obviously, we'll be talking a lot about the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation or New York Community Bank Foundation or whatever happens to be. So we still do our grant making there. We hope that it's better informed grant making because we've been involved in this collaboration. And we sometimes do a line funding where 2 or more of us will get together and say, oh, you're doing that project, well, we can pitch in on that, or we'd like to do this, but we can't quite do it ourselves. But the main thing that we're focused on today and we want to talk about is the pooled fund that we have, which is the Long Island Sound Stewardship Fund, of which some of you, a few of you have heard, and half of those have been successful in receiving funds for, according to the polls. So we're going to now focus in on that pooled fund. That pooled fund was designed to address some of the problems that we as funders have seen facing groups in the Long Island Sound and facing people who want to make a difference around Long Island Sound. It's very much in line with what we discussed from the needs assessment. But it adds in this component of philanthropy is that, for most of us, our foundations are too small to really do all the things that need to get done. Or we have legitimate geographical limitations to some of the work that we can do. It's no surprise that the Long Island Community Foundation, for instance, can only fund projects on Long Island itself. And so working together, we might be able to have projects that are bigger in total dollar amounts or bigger in geographical region that allows us to sort of punch above our weight. We also recognize that in the world of nonprofits, that there's a lot of difficult and burdensome funding opportunities. So sometimes it's difficult, even if you're just coming to work with the funders that was on that list or individual programs. If you had a project that required 2 funders like Genium and the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut, that's 2 separate applications that you have to do in 2 different places, probably on 2 different timelines, and that's burdensome for you. So within the realm of private philanthropy, can we reduce that burden? We also noted, as folks have noted before, that was part of the needs assessment, there can be what I call bulldozer money, like big money that can move earth and stuff like that. But there's a whole bunch of work that needs to take place prior to that, around startup, around planning, around collaboration that doesn't have a place for funding at the government level. And so perhaps private foundations can solve that problem. And then there's capacity building for organizations. It's very difficult to find money in general in philanthropy, but certainly around the Long Island Sound for groups that are just trying to build themselves so that they can better perform their missions. And so basically the big problem that we see is that there's this disconnect between the large sums of money that are available up in the sky and the groups that are working down on the ground and really need to get access to that. So we tried to design the stewardship fund to help address some of that problem. We can't make it go away, but can we do our grant making in a way that makes it a little less burdensome? So next slide, please. So what does the stewardship fund exactly? Basically anything that's in the CCMP, right? There's those 4 major themes. There's a whole bunch of tasks that need to get done and implementation actions, and it's a huge document. So if you care about the Long Island Sound, you'll probably find yourself in there somewhere. But that's the criteria that we use to say, if you're in this geographical region that involves the CCMP and you're doing activities that are outlined in the CCMP, then you can come to us at the Stewardship Fund to look for funding. And then we talked about sort of major priority areas that we wanted to cover. The capacity building, new collaboration, piloting tools and strategies, and small projects. But basically across all those priorities, which are outlined in our RFP, there will be this overarching themes of resiliency to climate change, long-term sustainability, and environmental justice, as we've talked about earlier in this program. Go ahead, next slide, please. So how much money is available and when? So it turns out that the RFP went live today, about 20 minutes before this call started. So you'll find it on the Long Island Community Foundation's website. So just go to licf.org. And I think they said either today or tomorrow, the portal that you use to actually submit your applications will be available starting either late today or tomorrow. So while you can find the RFP today, you might have to wait till tomorrow to submit your application. But we're going to have a webinar on the 13th, also at 2 o'clock at exactly the same time that the Connecticut grant writing one is scheduled. But both of that and ours will be recorded. So you can pick one and watch the recording of the other. And we will go into much detail about the RFP and answer a bunch of questions. We'll see applications come in due at the beginning of February. February and March will be review, and then we'll do contracting in April. Grants can range from $5,000 to $200,000 in range. Put an asterisk next to that $200,000 and remember that if you're going to ask for that kind of money, there's going to be some very specific requirements that you should take a very close look at. We'll maybe do one of those, maybe, in the entire application process. So don't, if 70 people come up, then the number of people who received funding will be 0 on next year's poll. So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. Tips. I would, first and foremost, make sure you hit one of those major category areas. And next, think a little bit about where you would go next. We're trying to close that gap between the groups on the ground and the groups and the money up in the sky there. So figure out how you would build from there, okay? Address the trust issues that we mentioned earlier in this part. Next slide, please. And then a couple of examples of things that we've done in the past. Some of you might be members of the Unified Water Study, participants in the Unified Water Study. That started as some aligned funding through Funders Collaborative of saying, hey, can we build, people said they wanted something like this. What's it going to take to find out if that's true? So we spent some money to find out if it was true. And they said, yeah, and it could look something like this. And we go, well, let's build that for a year and see how it goes. Hey, it kind of worked. Let's roll it out to 20 more people. Yeah, that's fine. And then once it got to that level, the EPA is like, that's the thing that we want to pay for, this already built functioning program. And now that's funded through the Long Island Sound Study. That's a good grant for our Long Island Sound Stewardship Fund. And it took multiple years. So this idea of being able to build from the ground up is really important. They don't have to be that intense. We've had a master plan for the Ash Creek community is looking at ways to come up with building a plan that works for their community. And then even at the capacity level, we've had funding for bookkeepers. So it really runs the gamut. It's not huge dollars, but it can be strategically placed dollars. So I hope that helps.
Great, thank you so much, Trip. So now I'm going to introduce our next presenter, Lynn Dwyer. She is the Program Director for the Northeast Coastal Northeastern Regional Office at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. She serves as the day-to-day representative for the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, a grant program focused on restoration and protection of the health and living resources of the Sound. She's also worked on a variety of other grant programs during her 16 years at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So take it away, Lynn. Lynn, you're on mute.
I have this new terrific microphone, which I'm still learning to use. I'm looking like I'm doing a podcast. Okay. Thank you. And it's now 19 years. Yeah, been running the grant program for 19 years. So thank you. Yes. Hi, everybody. I want to thank Sea Grant Long Island Sound Study Extension professionals for organizing this workshop and inviting me to participate. Wowza, what a turnout. This is great. And thank you for your interest in taking the time to participate. It's really much appreciated. We don't have a lot of time and I want to use it well to address your questions. So here we go. As mentioned by Elizabeth, the purpose of the Futures Fund is to restore the health and living resources of Long Island Sound. This is the program that I'm going to do a shout out and that I manage and do a quick overview, but really it's just one of the options for funding available to you from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Hopefully you'll put it on your list to consider, but the other NIFWF grant programs which may fit and you might want to take a look at, I recommend you go to our website at www.nfwf, National Fish Wildlife Foundation.org. You might want to look at National Coastal Resilience Fund or the 5-Star Urban Waters Program, all of them which have a geographic and priority fit to the types of things that I think you're interested in. As Tripp noted, and it's the same thing for the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, our priorities reflect the themes, challenges, solutions, targets, outcomes, objectives, strategies, and implementation actions of the Long Island Sound Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. The CCMP, government speak, it does sound very bureaucratic, but the CCMP was really designed to reflect shared conservation and community priorities at a regional and local scale. So hopefully that focus meets you where you live in terms of the projects you need to get on the ground. The CCMP is organized by themes: clean waters and healthy watersheds, which is really focused on improving water quality by reducing nutrients, combined sewer overflows, stormwater runoff, and point and non-point source loading into Long Island Sound. Because the Futures Fund is a program of the Long Island Sound Study, we, like many of you, the flag we salute is that CCMP, and we work within those themes. I think it's worthwhile to note, well, we can also fund wastewater treatment facility retrofits to reduce or prevent nitrogen loading up to 1.5 million. The amount is really not large enough to address larger scale projects at these plants, but we can be pulled with other money to be part of the solution. And I think your experience is that you tend to have to pull money from a variety of sources. Another interesting one, and I think because we have a lot of governmental, local, municipal participants, water quality projects like disconnecting impervious areas, which definitely relate to MS4 requirements, are something else that the Futures Fund can support. We can support watershed planning. We know that there are other sources of funds for this work, such as state-based 319 programs, but do consider us as a potential source. A second major theme of the Long Island Sound Futures Fund is restoring coastal habitat within the 12 habitat types targeted, coastal habitat types targeted by the Long Island Sound Study, and also species conservation, that's fostering diverse, balanced, and abundant populations of fish and wildlife. We also fund in the category of sustainable and resilient communities, which I think, because a resilience nexus is a big part of today's workshop, we support, one, the public engagement, knowledge, and stewardship activities of the entities around the Sound, but we also support nature-based projects that combine resilience, community, and conservation goals in any portion of the Sound watershed in Connecticut and New York. And I think this is really an interesting one based on some of the comments that we need to consider that nature, we operate on the footprint of nature, but also in communities. And those are things that we're looking at solution wise. Sometimes because we're a highly developed area, it's a hybrid solution, a little bit of gray, a little bit of green. So I use the nature-based solutions phraseology because that's sort of a driver for what we do. But we do understand that given site conditions like energetics or otherwise, you may have a little green, a little gray. We can fit within that footprint as well. The range of grants. I think it's a reasonably healthy amount of funds for the type of work that you might want to do. Planning is $50,000 to $500,000, so I think that can capture some fairly big projects. Implementation is $50,000 to $1.5 million. And then public participation in education, $50,000 to $250,000. Next slide. Okay, exciting news. I think we've done very well with the support of our congressional representatives to the Long Island Sound Study and focused on the Long Island Sound program. We're projected to have, again, $10 million in 2023 from Long Island Sound Study, EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. If you're curious about the photo, this is a living shoreline restoration in Fenwick, Connecticut, which was recently completed, and you can see we're moving sand and we're trying to make this community and the environment more resilient. Next slide. I think it's worthwhile to understand, and it's helpful for you. The eligibility of Long Island Sound Futures Fund projects is somewhat restricted by geography depending on the project type. These maps are located on the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Long Island Sound Futures Fund website with links. The links are in the 2022 RFP. It's closed right now, but you can follow the links in the old RFP to see if you fit in terms of geography, or you can ask us. So the education, stewardship, resilience, water quality, and fish patch projects may be in any portion of the Long Island Sound study area, which is the map that you see in front of you in Connecticut, New York. And as noted, things like education projects, they can occur in communities outside this boundary in those states, as long as the content is focused on the health and living resources of Long Island Sound. Next. Okay. Let's see. Habitat restoration projects, they must fall within the Long Island Sound coastal watershed boundary in Connecticut and New York. So you really can't seek funding for habitat restoration activities outside of this coastal boundary. And again, these maps, the links to these maps, you can find them in the former RFP. And Jimena, I know you're probably looking for the website location. It's coming, so you can take a look. I also recommend that take a look at the RFP. It gives you a sense of sort of what our priorities are and requirements and things like that. It gets tweaked a little bit every year, but the heart of it essentially remains the same. The next slide, please. Just a little quick and dirty on grant guidelines. And this is sort of a nice photo of bioextraction work done by Adelphi University in the Oyster Bay Cold Spring Harbor Complex. If you were wondering what that was, I just thought it was a cool photo. The project performance period, generally we try to, for just the standard grants, 24 months after grant award notification, and then larger scale implementation projects can go up to 36 months. Sometimes things get extended. Eligible applicants, 501c organizations, state, tribal, and municipal government, tribal governments and organizations, and educational institutions of all types. The match. I want to say something about the match because it sometimes raises fear and dread in people's hearts. No worries, we reduced it, yay. It's 25% of the total amount requested from the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. I know when you apply for grants, a lot of times they'll ask you for your entire budget, and we don't. We just want to know what you need to know, how much money you need from us, and you're only asked to match that. Thought I'd mention it because it can be an error in applications, and also forestall applications by people because they think they can't cover their entire budget with required match. The timeline. You can share your ideas January through mid-April 2023, and we're creating, give me a day or so, we're still setting up this particular email location, lisff23@nifwif.org. Send your questions, your ideas, your thoughts. We're going to do workshops in March and April, and I'm observing this workshop very carefully because I would like to watch what was done well, what seemed to work for you. So I'm very interested, virtual, in person. We're kind of working that through in our minds now. Proposals would be done by May 2023, and award notification in November 2023. Next slide. Okay. This is the part that the extension professionals told me was really significant for a lot of you. And so the tips of kind of preparing a competitive proposal. I want to spend the most time on this because I know the list of it's something of great interest. These are from my experience, and the list of recommendations may seem a little generic, but there are nuances based on the source of funds, public, foundation, and corporate, which Tripp sort of started to mention. And again, these are from my own experience, but also other funders. So I hope they're relevant and useful to you. So first off, read the RFP and associated documents. I know that sounds like a duh, but not every grant program has a formalized RFP, request for proposals, but government programs often do. And while it's really exciting to see where your project ideas have a fit to program priorities, that you read that section of the RFP, it's really worthwhile to review sections like ineligible activities or budget items, compliance requirements. Even for past applicants and grantees, requirements do change. These topics tend to be addressed later in RFPs and are really easy to overlook, but they're important to address in a proposal in your timeline, in your budget. A lot of funders also have frequently asked questions, staff contacts, workshop information, and other resources to help you provide context to your activities to fit within the grant program. So I know they're long and sometimes they're not all that interesting, except the part where they fit your particular project directly, but I highly recommend that you review the entire RFP. Second thing is really sharply focus proposal narrative. Applicants do have a wide foundation of knowledge about the problem that they hope to address. Great, we appreciate it. It's very interesting. But we often see narratives with significant in-depth general information before the specific project, that problem that you're aiming to address, actually you get to it. So it'll be like 9 paragraphs and then, and we'd like to do this in this area. I would more sharply focus, maybe leave out some of the more general information like we have a problem with plastics pollution, and then to give every statistic nationally and internationally associated with plastic pollution is probably not the best strategy. So sharply focus. Consider your reviewers. Often they have dozens of proposals to read, and a sharply focused proposal makes a real difference. I think it really generally breaks down into primary project activity or purpose, specific problem the project aims to address, in the geography that you're operating in, how you're going to address it with the project activities, describing your major activities, and then the outcomes that will occur within your project performance period, your start and end date. So for example, if you were doing salt marsh restoration in New York City, you would perhaps want to stabilize a shoreline in Queens. You're probably not going to solve the problem of climate change in New York City. So don't make that one of your outcomes. Really focus on what your project's going to do, how you're going to do it, and then what you hope for the outcomes will be. I know it again sounds a little duh, but it's interesting. I think we get excited about ideas and problems, and we overwrite these proposals. Providing relevant letters of support, photos, and plans. When I was in graduate school, we did a mock proposal preparation for a grant writing class, and we attached a bunch of reports to show our prowess in the subject area. I cringe looking back on that particular experience in my life. Don't do that. Generic letters of support, entire plans rather than a plan element you are addressing. Don't make for a competitive proposal. Remember those reviewers who are reviewing many, many proposals? You want to get them focused on what are important. So before photos, if you're looking to restore an area, so someday we'll have an after photo. Letters from effective audiences and constituencies affirming participation and value. All of this type of stuff is reviewed and appreciated. So again, these sort of generic letters, oh, this is great, from someone who's maybe not necessarily directly involved, it has less of an impact in terms of reviewer. But when we see something from, you're going to work in the farm community and you're going to do a soil health effort that's going to reduce nitrogen loading into a waterway that feeds Long Island Sound, and the local farm bureau says, we really need this and the farmers are going to participate, ding, 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 that really works. Collect required documents early. I make this recommendation, but have not always followed it myself in grant writing or life in general. Government, foundation, and corporate partners will often ask for standard docs like IRS 990s or audits. Get them early. Make sure they're relatively fresh in terms of the date prepared. This allows you to spend more time on key proposal items like narrative and budget. You don't want to be running for this documentation at the very end of just before you're ready to submit. It causes stress. Familiarize yourself with online systems. A lot of funders of all types have online systems. It's always a slog to learn a new system or to refamiliarize yourself with an old one. Don't wait till the last minute to check out a system requirements. Ask questions and integrate feedback. Some grant programs have staff assigned, some don't. Don't hesitate to ask for clarifications or help, even if it seems really basic. I'd rather you do it right and not have to, not be dinged because you didn't provide the correct information or put a budget line item that wasn't working. If you receive feedback, integrate it into the proposal. Suggestions are frequently, often, always based on a funder's in-depth knowledge of what will be competitive, either from their reviewers, their boards, or otherwise. For example, I know it's really hard to hear a project that you care about isn't likely to be competitive, but we want to respect the time it takes for you to prepare a proposal, and we want you to make a competitive submission. So if you're hearing something isn't really a good fit to the grant program, think about that and maybe use your time to submit to another program. Transparency in budgeting is a winning strategy. Research the costs of contractual items. I generally say, go out and ask for a couple of bids. You don't have to, from the vendor that you want to involve. You don't have to promise them work, just get some cost sense. Reviewers often have expertise to look at costs and understand them in terms of both cost effectiveness and reasonableness. So you want to make sure that your budget is real to the tasks that you're proposing. Where you can or are asked to do so, provide budget narrative or notes. I promise you, reviewers look at your budget narrative and notes. One common error that we see associated with a lot of our proposals is where a budget and a narrative are not aligned. So for example, you mention activities to be implemented, but there's no budget for that. And a reviewer's going to go, oh, did they forget? Is it not really going to be covered? Is this not something that's going to be occurring as a result of this project delivery? So make sure that what you write aligns with what you're asking for funds. Consider organizational capacity and needs. Funding programs, as Tripp noted, have different requirements. Government, usually more, corporate or foundation, sometimes less. As I mentioned, check the RFP. It can provide information about reporting requirements, how a grant is funded, for example. Is it reimbursable, or do they write you a check after award notification? Compliance, permits, quality assurance, competition requirements for contracting. You need to first consider, is this the right funding source given your organizational capacity? Perhaps you have limited or primarily volunteer staff. You have to do record keeping, reporting. Do you have the financial systems? That doesn't mean you can't apply. It's just you need to think about it relative to preparation of a proposal. You can often ask for budget for activities to support grant delivery, like someone's going to do your reporting. Or you find a partner or a fiscal agent to take on those tasks, and your organization is written in as a partner and in the budget. Start with a smaller grant request first and move up in later years to more expensive and complex projects with bigger ticket costs, like the Bruce Springsteen or Taylor Swift tickets. That's your later grant if you're not necessarily, ready to ask for that big ticket item. A couple of other costs, thoughts. I talked to a friend of mine that ran a corporate foundation this morning, and she said, say this to them. Have somebody who has not written your proposal read it before submission. She said that can really make a big difference because you think you're making sense. And then you read the proposal like a year later and you go, oh my God, was I smoking something the day I wrote this? Another thing, if you're anticipating permitting as part of what you'll be delivering, do some pre-consultations with the relative state, local, and federal agencies. This shows technical merit in a proposed submission and also informs your timeline. So those are some of the things that occurred to me, and I checked with some other funders to say, am I like, is this too? And they're like, yeah, I think that's a lot of the things that folks really do need to hear. So I know a lot of you are excellent writers of proposals and have been very competitive in your submissions, but it's worth thinking about. Next slide. Again, you have questions, you want to talk to us, we're setting up this mailbox. We asked IT, I'm not sure if IT has done it quite yet, but it'll be soon. Long Island Sound, LISFF23@nifwif.org. I told Elizabeth last week, I live to give feedback and she laughed at me. So, and next slide. Super cute bird. All right, that's what I have.
Thank you so much, Lynn. There has been a request that you do a workshop on grant writing. They said your tips are gold. So great job. And we will, yes, get Lynn to talk again in the future. So we just have a minute or so before we want to try to go into those breakout rooms, but I just want to try to get to a couple questions. There was a question about the stewardship fund and if it's only for nonprofits. I do believe that is the case.
Yeah, that is the case. So it's nonprofit NGOs for the most part. So that doesn't mean, however, that you can't be, if you can't figure out a working relationship with a nonprofit organization to have perhaps your municipality as a sub for the stewardship fund, especially if you're trying to plan for larger activities that might be covered by the Futures Fund, when you can be a direct applicant.
Great. And then there was a question about what percentage of a grant can be used for salary.
For the stewardship fund, there's no limit on that. There's limits in the other limits in the RFP about what we're trying to accomplish, but there's nothing that says that, you have to, you can only ask us for X number of dollars of salary.
Ask for what you need. That was sort of related to my comment about think about your budget and what your organizational capacity and needs are. It's fine to see a line item that says something like support for grant management activities or everything else that you need. So, you should ask for what you need to get the project delivered.
Thank you, guys. And then Lynn, final question for you. Does the Futures Fund evaluate relative environmental benefit as part of the selection process?
Honestly, we do review by category, CCMP category. So we'll go over the habitat restoration projects. We'll go over the clean water and healthy watersheds projects, but we do evaluate based on strength of proposals on an individual basis. And so that's based on the published evaluation factors. I don't want to make it sound, again, too bureaucratic, but if we publish that information, we want you to feel confident that that's the basis that we're evaluating your individual proposal. I will say that there's always more requests for funds than we have. So metrics play a big part, what your outcomes are and things like that. So professionals have been working with us on this. That's what we do. We try and, see the strength of the proposal based on the priorities in the RFP and on the evaluation factors.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lynn and Trip. This was a really fabulous session that I think everyone got a lot out of. And hopefully our next sessions will be just as great. So next we're going to move to some concurrent breakout sessions. We have 3 sessions that are going to be going on at the same time. one on shoreline planning and implementation, another on green infrastructure projects for stormwater, and then strategic climate planning for relocation. So you are going to be able to choose your breakout room, and I am going to tell you how you can do that. So in a minute, we will open the breakout rooms, and you're going to look for this breakout room icon on your Zoom toolbar. If you do not see that, you may want to look instead for a little pop-up that says click to join breakout room, or you may need to see if you have an icon that says more, and you may need to click that and then find the breakout rooms under that icon. Once you are able to find the breakout room icon, you'll click that, and then you should get a pop-up with the 3 breakout rooms. You see these join buttons next to each breakout. You're going to click join next to the breakout that you want to participate in. If you are having problems and cannot find the breakout, put in the chat what room you would like to go to, 1, 2, or 3. And we have a few people that will be helping folks that are having problems to get you to the breakout room you want to go to. If you are on the phone and not on your computer, hold tight and we will unmute you, and then we will ask you where you want to go. And I see a few people putting in where they want to go now. We haven't opened the breakout room yet, so hang tight. We're going to open them now. And team, I want to remind those that are supposed to be recording to please press record when you go to your breakouts. We will record all of them and share those recordings. All right, see everyone in an hour.
All right, and I'm also going to just chime in real